This is history made clear, where we rebuild the past from evidence, context, and consequence. On July 10, 1940, the Battle of Britain began in the usual way history changes, not with one perfect moment, but with a new pattern of danger. German aircraft crossed the channel. British radar stations watched the sky. Pilots waited near their fighters. Ground crews fueled machines that might be airborne again within minutes. Civilians looked upward and learned that the front line could now pass over houses, fields, ports, and airfields. Britain had not yet been invaded, but invasion depended on what happened in the air. The battle came after catastrophe. In May and June 1940, Germany defeated France and drove British forces from the continent. Dunkirk saved hundreds of thousands of men, but it did not save their heavy equipment or make Britain safe. Across the Channel, Adolf Hitler controlled the coast from Norway to western France. Britain stood as Germany's most visible remaining enemy in Western Europe. To invade, Germany planned Operation Sea Lion. But a crossing by barges, transports, and warships could not succeed, while the Royal Air Force could still attack the invasion fleet and contest the sky. That is why the Battle of Britain was not simply a duel between brave pilots. It was a test of an entire defensive system. At its center was RAF Fighter Command under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. The system joined radar stations, observer corps posts, telephone lines, filter rooms, sector stations, controllers, airfields, repair crews, and aircraft defenses and pilots into one chain of warning and response. Radar could not win the battle by itself. But it gave Britain time, and in air defense, minutes could be the difference between intercepting a raid and chasing wreckage. The machines became symbols: Spitfires with their sleek wings, Hurricanes that shot down many aircraft, German Messerschmitt fighters, Heinkel and Dornier bombers, and Stuka dive bombers whose reputation had been built over Poland and France. But machines still needed people. Many RAF pilots were young, some were British, others came from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Ireland, the Caribbean, and beyond. Their ground crews worked under pressure to rearm, refuel, patch damage, and send aircraft back into the sky. The early phase of the battle focused on the Channel and coastal targets. German attacks hit shipping, ports, and radar-related sites while the Luftwaffe tested British defenses. The Channel mattered because it was the invasion route, but it was also a trap. Fighter Command could choose when to engage, while German fighters had limited time over southern England before fuel became a problem. Geography favored the defender in ways that maps often understate. A damaged RAF pilot might bail out over friendly territory and fly again. A German aircrew shot down over Britain became a prisoner. By August, the pressure intensified. The Luftwaffe attacked airfields, sector stations, aircraft factories, and the infrastructure that made Fighter Command work. These attacks threatened the system more directly than the earlier Channel fighting. If sector stations were knocked out, if runways were cratered, if telephone links failed, if pilots and aircraft could not be organized quickly enough, Britain could lose the ability to contest the skies even if many aircraft still existed on paper. Air superiority is not just a count of planes. It is a question of whether those planes can be found, launched, directed, recovered, repaired, and launched again. The British system bent but did not break. Radar stations were damaged and repaired. Airfields took repeated punishment. Pilots grew exhausted. Squadrons moved north to rest and refit while others took their place. Aircraft manufacturing mattered as much as individual heroism because fighters had to be replaced faster than losses could cripple the force. The story of the Battle of Britain is therefore also a story of factories, mechanics, plotters, telephone operators, WAAF personnel, ambulance crews, and local civilians who kept stations functioning under attack. German leaders faced their own problems. The Luftwaffe was powerful, experienced, and dangerous, but it had not been designed primarily for a long, independent strategic campaign against an island defended by radar and an integrated command system. Its fighters had range limits. Its intelligence on British losses in manufacturing was often wrong. Its commanders argued over targets and strategy. The German air offensive could inflict damage and terror, but it struggled to produce the decisive destruction of Fighter Command that an invasion required. Then the battle shifted towards cities. After raids and reprisals escalated, London became a major target in September. The Blitz did not mean that Fighter Command was no longer important. It meant that civilians now bore an even greater share of the assault. Streets, docks, homes, churches, shelters, and fire stations became part of the wartime landscape. The move to bombing London relieved some pressure on RAF airfields, but it also opened months of civilian suffering. A truthful account has to hold both facts together. The shift helped Fighter Command survive, and it imposed terrible costs on people below. September 15th became one of the battle's symbolic climaxes. Large German raids met determined RAF resistance. Britain later marked it as Battle of Britain Day, not because the war ended that afternoon, but because the invasion threat became less credible as Germany failed to win control of the air. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion. The postponement did not end the bombing, and it did not end the war. but it meant that Germany had failed to force the air decision needed for invasion in 1940. Winston Churchill gave the battle one of its most famous lines when he said that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The phrase captured something real about fighter pilots, but it can also narrow the story too much. The few depended on many: radar operators, mechanics, controllers, aircraft workers, code and signal systems, nurses, firefighters, civilians who endured bombing, and international pilots who fought for a country that was not always their birthplace. Heroism was real, so was organization. The Battle of Britain also mattered beyond Britain. It was the first major defeat of Hitler's military expansion. It preserved Britain as a base for future operations, intelligence work, naval war, bombing campaigns, and eventually the return to the continent. It forced Germany to keep looking east and south without having eliminated the Western threat. It showed that modern war could be decided by systems as much as by armies: warning networks, manufacturing capacity, command discipline, and the ability to absorb punishment without losing coherence. There are myths to avoid. Britain was not saved by one aircraft alone. Spitfires were famous, but Hurricanes carried a large share of the fighting. Radar was vital, but not magic. German mistakes mattered, but so did British adaptation. The Battle of Britain was not a clean story of air combat without civilian cost. It was a campaign in which military targets, political pressure, public morale, technology, and terror bombing overlapped. Its meaning comes from that complexity. By the autumn of 1940, Britain remained vulnerable but uninvaded. The Channel had not become Germany's road. The RAF had not been swept from the sky. The British state had proved that it could coordinate technology, people, and manufacturing under direct attack, and the civilians under the bombers had learned that survival itself could become a form of resistance. The survival of Fighter Command also changed what later Allied strategy could become. Britain remained a place where ships could assemble, aircraft could operate, code breaking and intelligence work could continue, and political leaders could negotiate with allies from a position of endurance rather than exile. That mattered before the United States entered the war, and it mattered even more afterward. The island that Germany could not invade became an arsenal, an air base, a listening post, and eventually one side of the launch point for the liberation of Western Europe. The German failure was not simply a matter of courage meeting courage. It exposed the limits of forcing a political decision from the air when intelligence is flawed, targets shift, and the defender can repair the system faster than the attacker can break it. Ports could be damaged, runways cratered, cities burned, and pilots killed, but the essential chain of warning, command, interception, repair, and replacement kept functioning. That chain is why the battle still feels modern. It was a contest between networks as much as between aircraft. The Battle of Britain began on July 10th as a struggle for air superiority over a threatened island. It became a turning point because it denied Germany the condition it needed for invasion and kept Britain in the war as a fighting base. It reminds us that defense is not only a weapon or a hero. It is a system built before the crisis, tested under pressure, and held together by people who may never appear in the simplest version of the story.